joining us for this session. We're super happy and excited to have with us Geoff Revell, the Managing Director of HappyTap. Geoff has 20 years of experience in business development, entrepreneurship, and WASH, and he was the co-founder of Watershed, which is a famous WASH organization recognized globally for its innovative approaches to water sanitation and hygiene markets in Asia. He is the founder and managing director of HappyTap, a social enterprise in the field of hand washing that started in Cambodia and is now scaling globally. So, Geoff, thank you so much for taking the time to join us to share a bit about your journey with HappyTap. Perhaps firstly, you could just briefly tell us a bit about just what is HappyTap and where it started and where it is now.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christian. Thanks everyone for joining too. It's a pleasure to have a fireside chat together, and happy to have a little bit of interaction here too. I can start us off by telling you a little bit about HappyTap, as Christian mentioned. Well, yeah, that was a good introduction, bringing you up to speed about our company, HappyTap. It's really I would say more of an advocacy company in a way, advocating for something we're trying to promote, a shift in mindset about hygiene and how hygiene fits into our lives, kind of. Most people think of us first as a product company, and that's not entirely wrong. We do offer a product, and that's the one, you can see that here next to my image in the screen that Christian's sharing, which is a hand washing station. I'll just mute my phone here. But if you look at our website, you won't find a picture of that device. And the reason is because we probably, I think, like many of you working in your respective social enterprises, we're trying to advocate for a new kind of vision, a new state. For us, the idea there is basically there's an old way of doing hygiene, and the new way of doing hygiene is to have hand washing within reach in many more places than we've previously had it in the past. Convenient, desirable, accessible, which are the key predictors of whether or not people actually practice hand washing, actually do it. So our belief is basically that once people kind of understand that that new state is needed, i.e. there is a need that we create, then there's an opportunity for us to offer a solution. And as Christian mentioned, we started in Southeast Asia. Our first production began in Vietnam back in 2013. So almost 10 years ago. And over the course of the last 10 years-ish, 9 years, we've expanded to some other countries, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, where we're producing, that is. And we've got staff and sales in other countries that we export to. And we've exported to countries all around the world. Today we sell HappyTap in the US, also in the UK, on Amazon, and in a number of channels. So it's changed a lot over the years.
Great. And maybe you can tell us a bit about your personal journey of what led you to start HappyTap. Like, what was the moment when you decided this was going to be something that was needed?
Yeah. Thanks, Christian. It's maybe a similar thing too, and I'll be interested to hear from some of the cohort here that HappyTap was the concept was born out of a negative experience. In fact, a perennial negative, or let's say frustration, with hygiene promotion. It's kind of the bane of public health officials. We've got something that's proven to be effective against a host of infectious diseases. We know that it's cheap, it's not complicated, it's safe. It just sort of checks all the boxes, but it is very difficult to get people to actually do it. And there aren't very many great examples of places where hand washing has been widely, successfully, habitually practiced by people. And so on the heels of a big intervention in Vietnam, it kind of gave us the impetus. In the mid 2000s, there was a large program funded by the Gates Foundation, implemented by the World Bank, called the Global Hand Washing Initiative. And they implemented a large scale kind of high intensity behavior change campaign in 5 countries in the world, spread all around the globe. Vietnam was one of them. And they did everything kind of right. You know, they followed the latest thinking on behavior change. Unfortunately, long story short is after a few years, they did an evaluation that was rigorous and found 0 change in practice. And that's not uncommon. I mean, that's kind of been the story for a long time with hygiene. Very difficult to find successful interventions. So out of that, we had the theory, well, perhaps the concept of a place that was dedicated for hand washing could, change the experience. And that was kind of for us and for me, but other colleagues too, I was working with at the time. We thought this could be an avenue to really not just be frustrated with those outcomes, but actually say, maybe we can build on this. It's not nothing that people got a lot of awareness and education in hygiene. So maybe there's an enabling step that can actually allow us to build on those gains.
That's really interesting. And everyone, feel free to sort of jump in with questions in the chat
Yeah, please.
at any point. This is a sort of an informal chat with Geoff to hear about his experience with HappyTap. But so Geoff, perhaps you can tell us a bit about when you were first getting started in those early days. What were the biggest challenges that you were facing, and how did you overcome some of those? And how long ago was that actually?
Well, what was the last part, sorry?
How long ago was that?
It's a little bit difficult to say because, as you mentioned, I was working in Watershed NGO, and it was a little bit of a part-time endeavor for me with HappyTap, and it became a full-time endeavor only really, at the beginning of 2020 or mid 2020, when the pandemic was kind of gaining force, and I thought that I should focus attention on a potential something that can contribute to mitigating the challenge of COVID pandemic. So 2013 or 2012, even going back earlier with design and thinking, was beginning in 2009, but it was never full time. But as far as what you mentioned about the biggest challenges, yeah, there were a lot, and probably some of what I've experienced, I imagine, was similar, though maybe hope not all of it was similar to what others have experienced. Probably the biggest challenge at that beginning stage was kind of stringing together all the pieces that you need to have in place to try to have a social enterprise. And I'm probably not using the correct jargon here, but when you've got to have maybe a product or a service, you've got to have a customer need, you want to have like distribution platforms or manufacturing partners if you have a product like us, funders, a good team, concept, scale plan, all these things that you've probably been thinking about in this accelerator cohort. I think that people I talked to were more used to hearing pitches that involved maybe 7 or 8 or 9 out of 10 of those things kind of being already lined up. And then we've already got all this. We've got the team. Here's our super team. We've already got like customer need identified and quantified. And we've got this like platform we can use to reach them. All we need is funding to do this or finalize the development of our product. And then, we're off, we're unlocking all this potential. And I always felt like in our case, none of those things were in place. You know, they wanted to hear more already has. We're like, we don't have a team yet and got a product concept, but there's not really a customer need and there aren't any distributors or manufacturers. There's no funding, none of this. And I guess the way I don't like the idea of like the Silicon Valley, what catchphrase that's so many people have run afoul with now, fake it till you make it, it's sort of, but I want to say that we kind of tried to instead put all this together, you know, at the same time with a great deal of let's say optimism. I really, and my colleagues at the time really had a clear vision, even though we didn't have anything in place, and kind of just like sheer irrational resilience with some humility for sure. I mean, I know that other people run afoul also this approach of just sort of like charging ahead when the conditions aren't right. But sometimes when you know there's a challenge like this and there's a public health crisis, I don't want to wait for other elements that are needed to come into a ready state. So we try to tackle too many things, I think, at once. And so far, okay, but I mean, I think that was the hardest thing. It's kind of an abstract challenge, let's say.
Chris had a great question in the chat. Chris, do you want to unmute and share that?
Yeah, not a problem. Sorry, I'm just in lunch. Yeah, I was just wondering how, working in some of the countries that you do, how you make sales in areas that are maybe a little bit poorer. Do you subsidize these using profits made in other areas to make it a bit cheaper for people to afford these? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, Chris. Thanks. We probably haven't explored the concept of cross-subsidy enough, but it doesn't seem like an easy thing for me to do, to have a great deal of price differentiation between different segments. For example, like we sell in the US HappyTap for $89 if you were to look it up. And then if you buy it in Cambodia, it can be $20. There's a big difference there. But the costs are such, like Amazon, when we sell it through Amazon, is taking usually something like 40 or 50 of that already, just for the, you know, the sale and the shipping. So I've never, if we could find some way of doing some serious cross-subsidy, I'd be interested, but I think that's easier said than done, unless we really like promoted something to be charitable, like a one-for-one type thing, perhaps, and not really done that in the past. So to sell to lower income consumers, we've tried to, from the very beginning, make them our target in a way. And it's not, low income isn't just a monolith, you know, even within that, there's quite a range. But one of the obvious ways, and we've certainly worked with them as well, but you've probably all thought about this, the concept of using installments and microfinance to spread out the costs over time. And our product, like many nowadays, it used to be within the price range that MFIs would be interested in, no longer is. So it has to kind of be bundled together with something else that existing clients typically are buying. We don't subsidize ourselves any product, but what you could say is that in many ways, subsidies have flown through our organization, because at various times we've received grants, and that's a form of subsidy that one way or another, you know, is lowering costs that we don't have to pass on to customers, at least immediately, maybe further down the road.
I think it's a sort of a big question for a lot of our innovators and others, about that balance between social enterprise seeking profit versus impact, how to reach the poorest. It's good to hear your experience there. If people have follow-up questions, just put them in the chat.
Well, and by the way, I would say that over years of working in this field, I'm pretty open to the concept of subsidies, because I know that it can be almost ideological, people's stance on that. I think there's a lot of room to be pragmatic instead of ideological, in a sense. If we really are interested in people accessing life-saving products and services that are essential for health, for example, then there's usually a decent argument from a public health standpoint for it to be subsidized. I think the question is not whether or not to subsidize it, it's how, and to make sure to do it carefully at the margin, and to make sure that it's a sustainable kind of thing, but won't undermine other things that you're doing. When people have run afoul of subsidies is when it becomes, it puts in jeopardy their, let's say, their main business or their other revenue streams, and the subsidy that's being offered can't be managed or scaled, managed over time or scaled. But having said that, there could be great ways of making a subsidy available so that low-income people could access things, doing it carefully and thoughtfully, I think.
Yeah, that's certainly one risk that is always in the back of my head, that if you were to subsidize it for a certain population, then how would that impact on other sales? Would areas kind of expect a bit more of a handout for them? And if there is any sort of rivalries between communities, like this community got it for free, these ones have to pay for it or have it subsidized. So I feel like it's a bit of a risk sometimes that you have to tread carefully with.
Yeah, definitely tread carefully. And there are some good rules of like a thumb kind of that have been developed, I think, for the development sector. For example, I think that it's much better to kind of use a demand side subsidy rather than a supply side subsidy. It's also great to preserve perceived value of your service. So Chris, if it's, for example, if it's a bottled water or water that you're providing, if you could find, if there are groups that can afford it reliably over time, but there could be a mechanism that's means tested. In some places we work, people have an ID card that's like a ration card in India, or an ID poor card in Cambodia, that means you're entitled to certain state funded benefits or even external agency funded benefits. Keeping it circumscribed to these groups and also funded through the existing sort of proper channels that they are taking, for example, a cash transfer or voucher to existing supply chain actors, has less chance of perverting perceived value through the supply chain. And then you're right, if some people say, hey, wait a second, Abundant Water, why do they pay this and we pay that? You wouldn't have to change your price. It would be just a question of those, some folks are getting funds to help them purchase your product at its normal price, which doesn't change for group to group, if you see what I mean. And I think there are a lot of good resources about this, I think, that I need to refamiliarize myself with, but there are some tricks, tips like that, I should say, tips.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so Geoff, going back to your journey, you started in Vietnam.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize that HappyTap had potential? That it was something that had potential to scale, and you were going to need to start to think about how that might happen? Like, did you run a test? How did it work?
Yeah, well, thanks, Christian. It might be, if anyone asks any of you, like in this cohort, when should you start thinking about scale, or when did you start thinking about the need to scale, then treat it like a trick question. Say always, always think about that from the beginning would be my suggestion. With HappyTap, my understanding of how we might scale has certainly shifted a lot, but I don't think there was ever a time where I wasn't thinking about how this could scale up, or how this ought to scale up. Yeah, you know, could and ought to, I suppose. The part of the question you asked, Christian, like, was there a test or something that we had done at different stages? Yes, many, many times over various stages, we've tried to understand things like, you know, product market fit, channels, marketing messages, 4Ps type things, to better understand, you know, the best avenues through which we could scale. And more importantly, in the last few years, I think my focus has, or my appreciation has grown of another P, which is partnerships, thinking more carefully about the type of partners we have to scale, because can't really think about that question so much as being like, how will we do it ourselves? I don't think there's going to be too many social enterprises that go that route, you know, of completely building up a gargantuan multinational company. No, it's much more likely that it's going to be public sector or private sector partners thinking carefully about who they are, what role they have, how you're complementing them, what you bring to them, what's valuable for them. That's one of the most important things, I think, to consider about scale.
I'd be interested to hear more about how your thoughts for scaling changed from the early days when you were envisioning how it might scale, to sort of how that shifted over time, if there are any sort of main themes there.
I guess it's just my learning, Christian. I don't know if it would be different, probably would be different for case to case, but I'm thinking, like, when we started in 2013, there was no Facebook in Vietnam, for example, and the mechanisms for e-commerce or delivery, like with Grab or, you know, these Uber, Gojek type app-based things, was extremely limited. And so our concept and my approach plan for scaling was really to work with some existing manufacturing partner that had large reach for distribution and production, and an avenue for marketing using a quasi-governmental type agency, which in Vietnam is called the Vietnam Women's Union. And, you know, probably like most things in social entrepreneurship, neither of those panned out for various reasons out of my control. You know, one of them was even political, related to the South China Seas issues, and the fact that my company was from Cambodia, and Cambodia was siding with China against Vietnam. It was sort of completely unrelated, but the Vietnam Women's Union was not allowed to work with us. So that changed things quite a bit. And I suppose everyone's business will probably have those pivot points in realizing this works way better than we thought, or this doesn't work at all. That's what we thought was going to work. Coming back to that resilience and maybe a little bit of irrational optimism, we had to shift a number of ways, some of which changed because of the times, the circumstances. Facebook one day was allowed in Vietnam, and that became an enormously popular channel for marketing, and then later for us, even sales, as well as e-commerce platforms. But we did do another shift when COVID started and really start targeting institutional clients rather than households. And that's a completely different kind of client or customer base, you know, institutions, and different sales cycle as well. So then our scaling, my perspective about scaling also changed when we started expanding to other countries. I started thinking about regions, tariffs, local manufacturing versus imports, and all the complicated aspects of logistics with that. And it'll probably keep evolving, honestly, I suspect, over the years ahead. So another question pop up.
Yeah, Thomas, do you want to share your question?
Yeah, no, thanks for your sharing, Geoff. Really appreciate it. This kind of builds upon the idea of pricing, especially when lots of us are working with at-risk communities, and then obviously understanding the value. So the first part is, what has been your experience in managing price sensitivity of the HappyTap product, especially when you enter new markets? In consideration of other competitors or the willingness to pay. Are you able to shed some light on that? That's for the first part, please.
Yeah, sure. It's a tricky one, and I've had a lot of people over the years talk to us about the understanding willingness to pay and ability to pay as being really critical things. Maybe it's controversial, but I totally reject it. I think that those kind of studies and the experiments that I've been involved with have been very fraught and sometimes misleading. I've had some accidental sneak peeks behind the scenes of some focus groups where, people were, everyone's gaming a little bit in those discussions, I think, and willingness to pay is so hard to understand. It's almost always, in my experience, and I know the country is probably, we're working and will have an impact on how your experience is, almost always higher than what we think and higher what everyone thinks. When we first started talking about having HappyTap on the market in Vietnam years ago, everyone said, well, it's got to be no more than 10,000 dong. No, sorry, 50,000 dong was probably the first real advice that we got. And that's, that's like $2 or $3 at the time or something like that. And when we started talking to people about, well, what if it was 100,000? Then people would say, no, that's too much. This is a great product, but it couldn't be any more than 70,000. But if we went and said, what about 150,000, which is, let's say $7 or $8, people would say, that's slightly too much. Maybe 100 would be the maximum. And it was just this sort of negotiation, and even the most, and those are consumers. I'm also thinking about people that we've spoken to who weren't taking the standpoint of customers, but actually just experts or market observers. And I think everyone's appreciation of what value would be ascribed to a product that, in our case, was deliberately made to be kind of aspirational and looking like premium was an underestimate. And I'm still today continue to kind of be surprised, even though I guess I shouldn't be, that price sensitivity isn't nearly as much of an issue with our product as, I guess, maybe for established categories. Perhaps people might be very well sensitive to products like rice that they would buy every day, and a small change in the price per kilogram adds up over time, but a one-time purchase in our case. Now, I know many of you in this cohort would have a different circumstance with perhaps subscription models or repeat pay scenarios that might change the thing a little bit, but I caution you to not start low with pricing. I would advise you to try to figure out what's your likely ceiling where you would start to see some substantial drop off. So you really understand sensitivity, because you can always discount, and discounting with a lot of products can be done without actually sacrificing, which is considered to be the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, or in the case of other services and products, it could just be the list price. So sorry, that's a kind of a long answer, Thomas, but I hope that gives you a little bit of insight from our experience.
Very insightful. Thank you so much. And if you don't mind me just piggybacking off that question, is yes, for HappyTap specifically, and I think you've alluded to it, but hopefully you just share more insight, is changing the price. Like you mentioned discounting, but which I think is a great idea, and I want to explore further, but let's say you've introduced a particular price already to the market for the HappyTap, then after that it didn't work, or you realize that there's people that are willing to pay more. Did you ever change that marketed price, and how did the market respond, asking you questions or Yeah, how was that experience like?
Yeah, we've definitely increased the price pretty much consistently over time, and partly our costs have changed, but partly our appreciation of what it really means to have a supply chain that's incentivized to work with you, what that requires. I mean, we think that one of the most important things for our success, like I kind of mentioned earlier, is these partners. We have to think about what's in it for them. They can't earn nothing. They have to have something that's relatively competitive. They're usually across the board doing all other things as well. Once you bring that all together, you realize, okay, it costs, and to be competitive and have some mind share, we need to have a price that compensates people for their inputs and their risks and so forth. We've changed the price. I don't think, it's probably because like we haven't had a mass, you know, everyone isn't discussing the price of HappyTap like they're probably discussing, you know, the price of gas or gasoline or petrol or Netflix subscription or something like that. Everyone, you know, knows, but HappyTap is probably still less known to our advantage than that we could change the price, and I don't think anyone really notices. But funny that you mentioned this, because we've had press in the past, and one thing we were talking about internally the other day was that, we have this like Al Jazeera news piece that was on TV from 8 years ago or something, and they quoted the price of our product in the news piece, which, you know, we can't control. But we were talking about, I wonder if we should still like share that piece with people, because it looks great and it's kind of still nice, but it does mention this price now that is going to potentially be confusing. It's much less than what we would charge now. So I don't know the answer, I guess, on that one. Don't ever when you have people in the newspapers or media talk to you, try to not let them say the price. I would say, because it'll be forever imprinted in that way.
No, thanks for sharing, Geoff. Much appreciated.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Thomas. So Geoff, as you were sort of starting to scale outside of Vietnam into other countries, what were some of the sort of biggest challenges you faced sort of personally and for the organization during that, let's call it a scale up?
Yeah, well, let's put aside all the sort of usual challenges or things that would be kind of specific to our case, like, you know, the usual business things. I think the more cross-cutting and kind of important thing is team, people, finding the right people that are going to be, do you know the expression they say, in the trenches with you, like really, or another idiom, drinking the Kool-Aid, like people who are going to be completely bought in to your mission and, you know, completely back to back with you, fighting out against some, you know, huge challenges that are going to come around unavoidably. That's really difficult. I would say nearly impossible, probably for obvious reasons, like we're offering the career package of low pay, high risk, low prestige, difficult work, you know, all the attractive things. So on a personal level, I think that's been really challenging. And even like maybe you've kind of experienced some of these things too, where you feel I felt very almost like gutted at times when I, you know, recruit people and then you invest a lot in working with them, and you can't help but invest kind of emotionally too. It's your baby, it's your vision, and you deeply rely on people. And then when you lose them for one reason or another, yeah, I think that feels like a real blow, you know, because you have to pick up so many pieces. But it's also good to remember that you do recover from that. And so you got to keep that in mind. You manage, and in my experience, every time where I've thought something was really almost catastrophic, it hasn't turned out to be. But I've also found, going to different geographies, Christian, that working styles, as people say, but you know, it's sort of what, like a big cliche that, oh, you know, different working cultures and stuff, that's definitely a thing. And I've experienced a little bit, not just different cultures of geography, but backgrounds, like people from NGOs or from businesses or from technical sort of backgrounds, and even generational gaps, you know, people who are 21 and people who are 60. That can create great conditions and really be energizing, but it can also create conflict that can suck up a lot of energy and divert it from our work. So that's something that's been challenging, and I've been learning about trying to do better in managing.
So like you mentioned a lot about people there, like in terms of the speed that you've been able to scale, like what's the main thing that's sort of, let's say, that's determined that speed, that's sort of held you back from scaling faster, as it were?
Oh yeah, it is people, Christian. Yeah. There are some places right now that we would definitely be working in if that we aren't, if we either had someone that we were working with there or hadn't lost someone that we were working with there. Yeah, I think that's, everything else is kind of manageable, with the exception, you know, of what they call like acts of God, like force majeure type situations, conflict or disasters or things. But besides that, like if we have real challenges working with government partners or quality control or improving our marketing or anything, all of that's going to be done by hopefully great people that we can rely on. And without them, none of that happens. I think it's pretty straightforward. I bet we would be, and then, you know, it's something addressable too. I mean, something that's held me back a little bit with COVID and not being able to travel is that I used to really like to do any kind of recruitment activities, especially for key people, with a lot of in-person interaction and getting to know them and pounding the pavement, so to speak, meeting lots of different potential candidates for key positions. And with COVID, you know, that changed my approach there. And I really want to get back into being able to do more of that in-person stuff, especially when it comes to developing close working relationships with people. Right now in our team, there are several staff that I've never met in person. And I just met several of them in person on a recent trip. And we all didn't know how tall each other were. We knew what our faces looked like, but when we stood together, it was a real shock. So.
Yeah. So I'm interested, like, you know, as you talk about scaling and into new countries, you know, you were there from the start, you were the founder. So how's your mindset changed, and how's your approach had to change from those founding days to where you are now?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I thought about that, Christian, when you mentioned that question. I think the big change for me is that I've mellowed out quite a bit. Yeah, maybe this is something typical with like people in a founder position, that you're touching everything and you're working really hard. In my case, I think I really was, I don't know, you don't want to say perfectionist, but kind of like I wanted to look at everything. I was reviewing everything and driving hard, working a lot. And that may have been necessary and really good for a little while, but I don't think one can really keep that up with a healthy lifestyle at the same time. I think there's a lot of people who've thought about that for founders and teams. It's probably not an uncommon experience. So it was okay for a while, you know, but now also my family's changed. I've had a few kids and want to have a bit of better balance in terms of lifestyle. So I've had to kind of like, okay, you know, not be a little bit more comfortable with not overseeing everything, which is probably great, right? That's something that could be really better with a lot of my team and empowering to teammates. There may be, with my own change, there may be a few missed opportunities too, but I think if you can avoid some sort of founder burnout, which is definitely true and happens, and people suddenly have to walk away, that's much more costly to the business than and to the mission than than throttling back a little bit. So that's probably been the mindset change most pronounced with me.
And for you, through this journey, as the founder, did you have people supporting you? Like, what sort of support was most helpful, or was it a lonely journey?
A bit of both, Christian, because certainly there are moments when it feels lonely, if when you're facing bad things, or like losing some key staff, for example, which may not be everyone's experience, losing key staff, but that feels, you feel the weight of everything on your shoulders in those instances. It probably feels pretty lonely. But I've also tried, and deliberately tried, and it's something I would genuinely suggest to others in this cohort here. I've tried to develop friendships with other founders and business owners, even in different fields. Definitely in different fields, outside development, even having regular kind of conversations. Partly it's just really nice to hear about other people's challenges, and to also know that, okay, it's not just me struggling with this thing or that thing, okay, and other people are facing that. But then, when I have to explain a little bit what we're doing and the challenges we're facing, a complete outsider's perspective is pretty nice. I have to explain things in a way they can understand, and they don't have preconceptions, so they can give a different viewpoint. And yeah, we've been talking. I've got a couple of groups of people like that I'm trying to keep in contact with, talking about all the things like, managing a team and recruiting and retaining people, how to communicate with investors, the ups and downs of that, managing your own cash flow and liquidity and all those kinds of things. Everyone deals with that, and it's kind of nice to bounce ideas around with people who have no stake, and no horse, so to speak, in the race that you're in.
That's really good to know, and I hope through this program that our innovators form connections as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great outcome of this type of group experience, I think.
Chris, you had a great question in the chat. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned, Geoff, a little earlier that you worked with different partners such as government, and I was wondering whether advocacy was needed in order to secure those partnerships, and whether advocacy overall has helped to sort of push your product to get it out and a bit more known.
Yeah. Well, Chris, that goes right to the heart of it a little bit, because when I mentioned at the beginning that people view us as a product company, but I want to give you the perspective that I think what we really are is an advocacy company. Because relatively speaking, making our product and shipping it around to people, and then everything that goes on with that, even after sales service and quality checks and product design and whatnot, that's kind of relatively easy compared to the advocacy part, which is, I think, a critical, necessary condition before we can do what we want to do and provide this. This may be applicable to a lesser or greater degree, but I think, to the companies you all are working in, but typically in the social sector, we're not just responding to this enormously expressed demand, like for something people lay up all night dreaming about having a smartphone or something exciting like that. At least in the case of hand washing, nobody is lying awake dreaming about a hand washing station that they could have. And And for things for public health, usually, you know, they're things that we don't really want to do, but we should do. Advocacy for HappyTap is, yeah, what I ask our team to really focus on almost exclusively. And that's the idea of communicating our mission, like letting with governments, agencies, regulators, all the people involved that underpin a sustained hygiene service in different institutions or in households. They have to, I want them to come to the conclusion, as we have, that based on all the evidence, having greater access to facilities is necessary to get the kind of hand washing behavior we all really want. And there's a belief, I think, that's longstanding that facilities we're already good on that, no problem. And data supports, I mean, the data we collect kind of reinforces this misconception. We say, does the school have hand washing? Check. And the data is just reported kind of like yes or no. So if you're a school with 5,000 students and you have one hand pump with a bag of laundry detergent next to it behind the toilets outside the building, you get a check. But if you determine that only 2% of students are washing their hands at the critical moments, you say, well, facilities already have a check. So it must be a problem with not enough, you know, awareness raising and behavior change. Our advocacy mission is to tell all these guys, convince all these guys and persuade them using, I think, pretty robust data that exists, that no, the facilities, that they need to be within line of sight, they need to be more accessible. They can play a much more important role in getting the kind of behavior we want. And so trying to communicate that is like the major part of our undertaking as a company.
Yes,
Geoff,
thank you.
Sorry. Thanks, Chris. Geoff, you mentioned about you know, the challenges of selling wash products. You briefly touched on that. So how do you do it now? What sales channels do you use? Do you have sort of sales agents actively sort of going out and selling this? Is it in retail? Like, what approach have you taken to try and secure sales?
Yeah, a lot of different things, Christian. You're right. You know, the things that you mentioned, indeed, as well as other things. And I don't know if this will be, maybe it's relevant for the cohort, but because we're in different places, it gives us the chance to experiment in different ways in different places. And we kind of, for example, like one of my colleagues in Madagascar is leading a trial internally to see if, you know, it's a bit of a experimental thing, but it's to see if placing HappyTap hand washing stations in locations like in restaurants or pharmacies or even healthcare settings can be funded by advertisers in relevant fields who want to use the space that HappyTap provides. And because it's an interactive experience with someone, is that a good venue? Basically like treating it as a billboard and letting that be the kind of channel by which HappyTap propagates. And we've had a little bit of success there, so it's potentially interesting. So she's kind of testing that, trying that and whatnot. Meanwhile, we've got someone in Bangladesh who's very much focused on trying to figure out what is the exact balance that we can reach households that are low income by preserving their perceived value of our product, but lowering barriers for their uptake, not just financially, but otherwise. And he's doing a whole bunch of things with partner MFIs and retail outlets and distributors in low-income settings there. We also have a straight up durable goods distributor partner commercial in several of them in India who are bringing the product through their normal channels on trucks and so forth. But keep in mind that a bigger proportion now than ever before of our clients is institutional. And like I said before, that also changes things a lot. we're trying to sell to an institution. You can imagine in the health sector or the education sector, those are the two big sectors we're reaching, like schools and healthcare facilities. The people who buy HappyTap aren't the people who use HappyTap. But even buying, there's procurement, but there's also funding. The people who budget for soap over time, the people who install them and maintain them, the people who regulate it, but also the people who decide, like principals or health center directors, they might all be different. And that's typical of an institutional selling process that usually we, the proponent of a solution, need to almost go into that organization and bring all those things together, because they all have to, it's not going to happen usually on its own. So it's very proactive, almost like working as a consultant in the institutional setting. I see Chris got one more. Mention the importance of data. Do you feel that you need to invest in a lot of M&E? Yeah, that's a great question too, Chris. Look, it touches off something. How are we for time? We've just got a few more minutes. There's a message, like Christian also asked me if there was anything that I thought would be relevant to share, and this question kind of leads into it. So let me take just a minute and explain about that if we're good. Christian, is that all right?
Yeah, please.
One of the things I think we really struggle with, I mean, HappyTap, but sort of social enterprises in general, they talk about this thing I'm going to mention, like in Beyond the Pioneer and the Pioneer Gap, and that series of papers that was done by Monitor and FSG. But it's basically, we have to rely on so many things outside of our control. And what do we do when so many of those things aren't working well, but they're outside of our control? They're outside of our mandate as a company, you know? So for example, we provide this hand washing product to a healthcare facility, but it needs all these things that I mentioned in order to function properly. Like, really, if my background is in WASH and thinking about this, you need to have policies, you need to have management models within the facility, you need to have standards, usually like national level standards. What's a bunch of things we call enabling environment. You need to have financing, you need to have trained staff, you need to have infrastructure like water access, you need to have monitoring like Chris mentioned, and accountability mechanisms or incentives for things to function, for hand washing stations to be maintained. You might even need leadership, like going back to the health center director, and other things that I could go on. But if any one of those things isn't really working, that could lead to the failure of the solution we're offering. So then a big challenge for us, and I think probably for you guys too, is finding the right mix of things that we'll invest in doing and trying to improve, and recognizing the things that we cannot. So we'll still come to the conclusion that those things that we cannot, those are still critical. We depend on them. So what then? And a lot of people in the social enterprise space, like sort of Silicon Valley influenced and whatnot, have responded by trying to like heap on a lot more money to the social enterprise. You get a few, get a ton of money, and then they're just going to take care of like the vocational training for everybody and developing the standards themselves, you know, really leading these things from a firm perspective. I don't think that's feasible for us or for most, you know, and I don't even know that it's appropriate. It's too risky. I think the smarter and more resilient approach is to think carefully, like I mentioned earlier, about the partnership aspect, the fifth P, you know, who's there well-positioned and with a mandate to work on those things. So in the case of monitoring M&E, there's a lot more to monitor than just like what's happening at the HappyTap station itself with people washing their hands. I want to know what the janitor's doing, and I want to know, you know, what the mechanisms are that sit behind the janitor, and the person is supposed to be budgeting around the whole system and how that's working. So I want to get to work with these guys to help them accelerate concrete improvements, you know, no regrets type things that can happen quickly. But we have to be so choosy about where we spend time. And I think maybe this is relevant for you. The challenge that has come up time and time again for us is that when we try to do this, one thing is that there are often agencies like international agencies or NGOs or UNICEF or WHO or governments or associations, and they will say to us sometimes, we can't partner with you because you're a company or a vendor and it's a conflict of interest. And they see us as being in a box, like a company. So just do your thing, you know, and it's a bit of a dichotomy, because if you're being told to stay in your lane and just do your thing, but you recognize there's all this other stuff that needs to be improved, how can you credibly partner with them? Anyway, that all brings us back to why our website doesn't have a picture of the HappyTap on it. Why advocacy is the #1 mandate of our team. I think that we can't wait for those things to just be fixed in the healthcare setting. It might take decades for those things to improve. We want hand washing improvements more quickly to address a public health crisis today. So anyway, I could go on and on. I won't go on and on about that, but I hope that's clear what I'm trying to communicate there. Long story short is, we don't try to lead all the behavior monitoring within these settings, like in a healthcare setting or in a school setting, because there are existing systems for monitoring safe learning environments in general in a school, and quality of care in general in a healthcare facility, into which hand washing is a piece. Usually that monitoring system is deficient. It's tempting to go and create one and get funding to do that and whatnot. A lot of our donors might be very pleased if we did that, but I kind of reject that, Chris. So maybe there are just some differing views on this, or I'd love to hear some feedback on that, because it's a bit of a provocative thing I'm putting forward.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting perspective to hear, and yeah, I think definitely the importance of using what's available is something that we can all take away, definitely with partners for sure. Thanks.
Geoff, that's super interesting. I think that some really interesting insights there. It must be very frustrating when people turn around and say that they can't partner with you because you're a private company. And certainly I've come across that roadblock a few times before as well.
It happens a lot, yeah. And I worry, like I'm wondering if we should like change our company name or something, so that our product and our company name aren't the same. So that, I don't know if that'll actually make any difference, but I want to be perceived as what I really truly believe we are, a genuine partner working towards the same vision as, well, for example, as UNICEF or as a government or as a public health agency, not just really trying to, you know, hawk a single product.
Yeah, I get that. We are up on time, so I guess we will wrap up. I've really enjoyed hearing more about HappyTap and your experience, Geoff. Not just HappyTap the product, but HappyTap the organization.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm sure it's been useful for our innovators as well for this cohort.
Oh, and by the way, Christian, I mean, if anybody in this group, I mean, I feel an affinity to what you all are trying to achieve, and Christian shared with me the profiles of all of your companies, and you know, many of you guys, I felt like you've done so much, and I envy and congratulate what you've been able to achieve. So I almost feel a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure I can offer something from the standpoint of a successful wash enterprise. What I can really just offer is someone who like struggles along with you. So in that spirit, if anyone has any interest in following up on something with me, I'm happy to stay in touch and build my network with you, and vice versa.
That's really kind. Thanks so much, Geoff.
Yeah. Okay. Cheers, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you so much.